This one is the most brutal case that I've seen in my experience here.
Those words came from a seasoned investigator who had spent a career looking into the worst that people could do to one another, and even he was shaken. Because the moment they responded to a fire at two luxurious homes, they discovered that one of the homeowners was the suspect. The level of planning and betrayal he went to is the kind of thing that will make your blood boil. So how could a man who attended family dinners, co-ran two successful businesses, and called himself a brother and an uncle, become the person responsible for one of the most calculated acts of violence New Jersey had ever seen? This video is dedicated to Keith, Jennifer, Jesse, and Sophia, to ensure their lives are remembered and their story told in a way that honors them forever. Like many happy, close-knit families, the Cano family seemed to be the picture of the American dream. From the outside, they had everything anyone could hope for: thriving businesses, two beautiful children, and a stunning mansion to call home. Keith Cano was 50 years old. He had spent his entire adult life building something real. As a teenager, he worked as a janitor at a computer store. That job put him around computers, and computers became his life. In the 90s, he started a tech consulting company that would eventually become Square One, a successful technology business he ran out of Asbury Park, New Jersey. Keith also held a real estate license and had recently earned a master's degree from Columbia University. He was driven, ambitious, and by every account, he was the kind of man who never stopped pushing forward. His wife Jennifer was 45. She was the steady presence beside him, sharp, devoted, and deeply committed to their family. Together, they had built a life in Colts Neck, Monmouth County, New Jersey. And if you've never heard of this place, it's known for being a quiet, wealthy, and peaceful township. Homes there are large and spread out, often sitting on acres of land. It has a strong equestrian culture that locals even call it horse country. Because of its privacy and grand estates, it has attracted a few well-known musicians and athletes over the years. And the Cano family lived right in the middle of that kind of lifestyle, surrounded by space, comfort, and quiet luxury. Their son Jesse was 11 years old. Their daughter Sophia was 8. Those two were the reason for everything Keith and Jennifer worked for. Every long hour, every business decision, every dollar saved, it was all for them. But on the morning of November 20th, 2018, all of that was taken.
Fire.
Where?
Willowbrook Lane, Willowbrook Road.
That call came in at approximately 12:38 in the afternoon. Firefighters rushed to 15 Willowbrook Road in Colts Neck. But what they found was shocking. On the front lawn, there was a body, and behind it, the massive mansion was already completely swallowed by flames. The fire had been burning for hours before anyone even realized it. By the time crews arrived, it was far beyond a small blaze. It took hours to finally put it out, and when the smoke cleared, the house was nothing but ruins. Inside what remained of the house, investigators discovered 3 more bodies. Jennifer was found on the stairs leading to the basement, Jesse on the kitchen floor, and Sophia near a landing on the lower level. All 3 had been killed before the fire reached them. Keith had been shot 5 times, once in the lower back and 4 times in the head. Shell casings near his body were stamped GFL 10-9x19, a 9mm caliber. Jennifer had been shot in the head and stabbed multiple times. Jesse and Sophia, just 11 and 8 years old, had also been stabbed. Autopsies later showed that smoke inhalation also contributed to their deaths, meaning they were still alive when the fire began. But here is the detail that changed everything. 7 hours before the fire at Keith's mansion was even reported, at 5 in the morning that same day, a second fire had already been called in, 20 minutes away, at 27 Tilton Drive in Ocean Township.
What's on fire?
I have no idea. Our alarm just went off and my whole house is filled with smoke. Everyone's outside.
Is everyone out of the house?
Yes. Okay.
We'll get everybody over here. Okay.
I have a turtle inside, too.
Don't go back in for it, unfortunately. We're going to get everybody over there, okay?
That house belonged to Paul Cano, Keith's older brother. Paul, his wife, and their 2 adult daughters were outside in a Porsche Cayenne when firefighters arrived. And unlike Keith's family, the people in this house have no injuries. The fire was contained within about 20 minutes. On the driveway, investigators noticed a red gasoline can sitting beside a Porsche. It had what appeared to be gasoline staining on it. In a shed at the back of the house, there were 3 more gas cans, with a visible gap on the shelf where a 4th one had been stored, the same red can that was now sitting on the driveway. Fire investigators quickly determined the Ocean Township fire was arson, and they turned their attention to Paul Cano's surveillance cameras. the ones mounted around his property that should have recorded everything. Paul told investigators they could review the footage, but he mentioned he might have turned off the recorder earlier, because it was, he said, slowing down his Wi-Fi. However, the cameras were hardwired. They did not use the internet. The footage showed that at approximately 1:30 in the morning on November 20th, Paul Cano walked into his garage, approached the DVR system, and manually shut it off. He did not want a record of when he left his house. He did not realize that shutting off the camera was itself a record. And the most shocking piece of the investigation came from a 911 call made around 3 in the morning.
Do you have hunting in the middle of the night or something?
No, you're not allowed to hunt anywhere in the middle of the night. Wait, are you hearing gunshots?
I heard gunshots, yeah. I was in bed. Yeah, I heard up, and then went just hearing the gunshot.
The caller lived just 3.5 miles from Keith's home, and their report matched the scene perfectly. Keith had been shot 5 times, and they had heard 5 gunshots. Police responded quickly, but they couldn't pinpoint exactly where the shots had come from. It wasn't the only report that night. Another neighbor said they heard 4 to 5 shots around 3:10 a.m. By now, it was chillingly clear. Someone had killed Keith right outside his own house. The attacker didn't stop there. They went inside, murdering his wife Jennifer and stabbing her repeatedly before turning on their children. Then, just 20 minutes away, another Cano brothers' house had been set on fire. From the outside, it might have looked like a random act of destruction, a targeted attack on the family. Any outsider at the time could have easily thought that, but detectives saw things differently. The moment they spotted the red gasoline can behind the Porsche, they knew Paul knew far more than he was letting on. And from that moment, it became clear. They had to uncover the true connection between the 2 fires and the 2 brothers. Paul and Keith Cano were born and raised in Brooklyn. Paul was the older brother by 1 year. They were, by all accounts, extremely close growing up. They looked out for each other. They both married women from Staten Island and eventually settled within 20 minutes of each other in New Jersey. They were very close to the point that Keith was Paul's best man at his wedding. Together, they built 2 businesses. Square One, the technology company, was 90% owned by Keith and 10% by Paul. Their pest control company, EchoR, they owned 50-50. Both operated out of the same building in Asbury Park. Now, like many other siblings in the world, there is bound to be one who stands out a little more. In their case, that was Keith. He was the driven one, more ambitious, more accomplished, always pushing forward. Paul, on the other hand, seemed to exist just a step behind, quietly living in his brother's shadow. And for a long time, that didn't really bother him. It was just how things were. Somehow, they made it work. Then, in 2012, everything changed. Paul was seriously injured in a car accident, and the damage went far beyond the crash itself. The recovery was long and painful. He underwent multiple surgeries. He was left with a permanent limp and chronic back pain that never fully eased. It wasn't just physical discomfort. It was the kind of constant pain that chips away at your independence, your confidence, your sense of who you are. His world began to shrink. At one point, he even moved out of the Ocean Township home he shared with his wife and daughters. The distance wasn't just physical. It reflected how much his life had been disrupted. Financially, he started relying more heavily on the support system Keith had created for him. Because Paul was collecting disability benefits, his salary from the family businesses was paid directly to his wife. That structure allowed him to continue receiving disability while still being officially tied to the companies. It was meant to be a lifeline. $225,000 a year directed to Paul's household, even as his involvement in day-to-day operations became mostly nominal. For years, the arrangement held. It seemed like a quiet understanding between brothers, one stepping up, the other struggling to stay afloat. But by 2018, the balance had shifted. Whatever patience or goodwill had once sustained it was wearing thin. Keith had reached his limit. He had been growing increasingly frustrated with Paul's spending. Employees at both companies said the businesses were doing fine from the outside, but Keith had real concerns. He wanted to sell the pest control company. He was hoping to transition out of the partnership entirely and move toward working at one of the larger tech firms. He had worked his whole life to build something, and he had started to feel like Paul was taking advantage of it. In fact, on the day before the murders, November 19, 2018, Keith sent an email to 2 business associates. He forwarded a copy to his younger brother Corey, apparently to keep him informed. In that email, Keith wrote that he would not be paying another single penny to Paul Cano's wife until missing funds from the businesses were fully accounted for. And it went much further than that. You see, Keith had established an irrevocable trust, funded by a $3 million life insurance policy, to protect Jennifer and the children in the event of his death. He appointed Paul to manage it. Paul was responsible for paying the life insurance premiums out of that trust. And guess what? Paul was not paying them. Instead, investigators found that he had been taking the money for himself. He was having an extramarital affair. He was paying his girlfriend's bills, covering her daughter's college application fees, and working toward purchasing a home with her in Florida. To hide the theft, he had been sending Keith doctored PDF documents, statements altered to show the life insurance policy as current and active, when in reality the premiums had gone months without being paid. And separately, according to a wrongful death suit filed by Jennifer's father, Paul had also been taking money from college funds Keith and Jennifer had set up for Jesse and Sophia, $90,000. Keith and Jennifer had discovered this approximately 6 months before their deaths. Keith's own home surveillance system had captured the confrontation in chilling detail. In an audio recording from inside the house, Keith can be heard confronting Paul directly about the unpaid premiums and missing money. Jennifer's voice is audible in the background, pleading with Paul, essentially telling him the deception had to end. Keith demands the login credentials to his own financial accounts, leaving no room for evasion. The very next day, Paul received Keith's email. His salary was being cut off. The fraud was on the verge of being fully exposed. The businesses were at risk, and the affair had become costly. And the one person who knew the full truth, his own brother. Investigators argued that Paul may have made a dark calculation. If Keith and his entire family were gone, the life insurance would pay out. The trust would pass to him. The businesses would be entirely under his control. And the one person with full knowledge of the fraud would no longer be alive to reveal it. It was a scenario that, to investigators, was horrifyingly plausible, a deadly convergence of greed, desperation, and betrayal within a single family. When investigators searched Paul's Porsche after his arrest, what they found made the picture complete. Inside the car were parts of a 9mm handgun, a suppressor, and a night vision thermal imaging attachment, the kind of equipment that lets you see clearly in total darkness. At 3 a.m, in November, on a property you have visited dozens of times and know like the back of your hand. In a safe at Paul's home, they found ammunition. When it was compared to the shell casings collected beside Keith's body on the lawn in Colt's Neck, it matched exactly. Same brand, same caliber, same stamp on the casing, GFL 10 9x19. That is not a coincidence. That is the same box of bullets. Near the spot in Keith's basement where the fire had originally been started, investigators found a plastic container. Whoever lit that fire expected the container to be destroyed along with everything else inside the house. The fire did not completely burn it. Inside was clothing soaked in blood. When forensic technicians tested that clothing, the blood came back as belonging to Sophia Cano, Keith and Jennifer's 8-year-old daughter. And then came the detail that prosecutors would later call the most powerful piece of evidence in the entire case. In the basement of Paul's own home, his house in Ocean Township, 20 minutes away from the scene of the murders, investigators recovered a pair of gloves and a pair of jeans. Both items were sent for DNA testing. Both came back with a mixed profile, meaning DNA from more than one person was present on each item. The first profile matched Paul Cano. The second profile matched his 8-year-old niece, Sophia's DNA, on Paul's gloves, hidden in Paul's basement. Prosecutors used a testing method called STR mix to analyze those mixed profiles. STR mix is a probabilistic genotyping technology. It is specifically designed to separate and identify individual contributors when DNA from more than one person is found on a single item. It is a relatively newer method, and the defense immediately challenged it, arguing it was not reliable enough to be used as evidence. The judge reviewed the science, heard arguments from both sides, and ruled that STR mix was admissible. The DNA evidence would go before the jury. Paul Cano was arrested within days of the murders. He was charged with 4 counts of murder, 1 count of aggravated arson for the fire at Keith's home, and related weapons offenses. He had also already been charged separately by Ocean Township Police with the arson of his own home, the fire he had set with his wife and daughters inside to make himself look like a secondary victim. On top of all of that, investigators uncovered the disability fraud. For years, Paul had been collecting government disability benefits while simultaneously drawing a salary through the family businesses, a salary paid to his wife in his name to hide the arrangement. That alone carried the potential for up to 10 years in prison if convicted. Paul Cano stood before a judge and pleaded not guilty to all of it. He maintained his innocence for the next 8 years. When the trial finally began in 2026, prosecutors walked the jury through everything, slowly, methodically, piece by piece. They started with the timeline. The neighbor's camera captured the white SUV leaving Paul's address at 2:07 in the morning. The gunshot reports from 2 separate neighbors at 3:10 in the morning. The car returning at 4:08. The fire at Paul's home starting at 5. The smoldering basement fire at Keith's estate not being discovered until 12:38 in the afternoon. And after deliberating for a matter of hours, the jury came back with their verdict. Guilty. 4 counts of murder, all 4. Paul Cano was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He will die in prison for what he did on the morning of November 20th, 2018.
How do you find as to count 1 of the indictment charging the defendant, Paul Cano, with the murder of Keith Cano?
Guilty.
A jury finding Paul Cano guilty of killing his brother Keith, then fatally stabbing Keith's wife Jennifer and their 2 children, Sophia and Jesse, at their Colts Neck, New Jersey home back in 2018. The 59-year-old also found guilty of setting their mansion on fire after the murders. Family members in court wiping away tears as the guilty verdict came in.
In the days after the verdict, the prosecutor stood before reporters and said what investigators had believed from nearly the beginning, that the evidence had always pointed in one direction, that Paul Cano had planned every detail of what he did that night, carried it out with calculation, and then spent the better part of a decade convinced that he could wait out the investigation and the legal process, that he could simply outlast it. He could not. Keith Cano started with nothing and built 2 businesses from scratch. He worked as a janitor as a teenager. He taught himself technology. He earned a master's degree from Columbia University. He set up a trust to make sure that if anything ever happened to him, his wife and his children would be protected. He gave his older brother a job, a salary, a financial lifeline, and the responsibility to manage the most important document of his family's future. He trusted Paul with all of it. Jennifer stood beside him through every year of building that life. She was the one who looked Paul in the eye during that final confrontation and made clear that the lying was over. She was right. She just did not live to see it proven. Jesse was 11 years old. Sophia was 8. None of them had any reason to see it coming, because the person who walked onto that property in the middle of the night was not a stranger. He was someone who had been there for family dinners, someone who knew every entrance, every corner, every room of that house. Someone Keith had trusted so completely that he handed him the keys to the trust meant to protect his own children, and Paul used that trust as the reason to destroy them. He drove back to his own house. He set it on fire with his wife and daughters still asleep inside. He sat in a Porsche on his driveway and waited for the fire trucks, performing the role of a man whose home had been attacked by whoever had also targeted his brother. His wife and daughters survived. Keith's family did not get that chance. That is the full weight of what happened on Willowbrook Road on the morning of November 20th, 2018. Keith, Jennifer, Jesse, Sophia, remember their names. While the Cano family case is devastating on its own, it isn't the only tragedy that unfolded this way. In another chilling case, a wealthy family was found dead inside their own mansion. The house later set on fire, as if someone was trying to erase everything that happened inside, but this time, it wasn't a brother responsible. The truth was even darker. It was the family's own patriarch all along.
They say a picture-perfect family can hide the darkest secrets, and for the Foster family, that saying would become a chilling reality. Around 4 o'clock in the morning on August 26, 2008, Shropshire's Central Fire Control received an emergency call reporting a fire at the Grand Osbaston mansion. When firefighters arrived, they were blocked by a large horse trailer parked at the entrance, and that delay cost precious time. By the time they made it inside, the entire house had been swallowed by flames. Tragically, so had the people who lived there: Christopher Foster, his wife Jill, and their teenage daughter Kirsty.
A millionaire and his family are missing after their country estate was burned down in an arson attack.
Bloody hell, it's very on fire, isn't it?
But there's still no sign of the owners, Christopher and Gillian Foster, or their teenage daughter, Kirsty.
As investigators began digging into the case, they discovered that the horse trailer had been deliberately placed to keep emergency services out. This was no accident. Something far more sinister had unfolded behind the mansion's locked gates. But who would do such a thing to a family everyone believed was so perfect? Shockingly, the answer pointed straight to the man who built the dream life himself, Christopher Foster, the same man who worked his way to millionaire status, who created the illusion of success, comfort, and control. And yet, behind that flawless image was a man hiding pressure, fear, and darkness no one saw coming. From the beginning, Christopher seemed destined to achieve big things. His mother, Enid, always described him as a natural go-getter, someone who was always chasing opportunities, even as a child. He wasn't the only one in the family with big dreams. He and his younger brother, Andrew, both shared a desire to become successful businessmen, following in the footsteps of their late father, who had been a sales director. But while their ambitions aligned, their personalities clashed. Chris was confident and commanding, someone who always took center stage. Andrew, on the other hand, was quieter, more reserved, often left in his brother's shadow. Their relationship had always been strained. Andrew would later reveal how difficult it was growing up beside someone who always seemed to outshine him. And yet, despite their differences, both brothers remained close to their mother. Enid adored them both, though it was no secret she had a special soft spot for Chris. In 1987, Chris married Jill, a gentle and supportive woman who later became a full-time housewife. 6 years later, in 1993, they had their only child, Kirsty. She grew up surrounded by comfort, wealth, and animals, especially horses. Kirsty was known to be kind and soft-spoken, and she had a passion for riding. Her world seemed as beautiful and untouchable as the one her parents had carefully built. But Christopher's journey to wealth wasn't always glamorous. In the late 1980s, he worked humble jobs, selling mattresses and using pizza boxes as makeshift insulation. Life was ordinary until one tragic news report caught his attention and changed everything. On July 6, 1988, the Piper Alpha oil rig exploded in the North Sea. The blaze lasted for days, killing 167 workers. It was one of the worst offshore disasters in history. However, Chris didn't just see a tragedy. He saw a business opportunity. He realized there was a massive gap in the market for fire-resistant insulation materials for oil and gas rigs. Acting quickly, he began developing a product that could withstand extreme heat. He called it Ulva Shield. But in order to prove it worked, he had to take a huge risk. He mortgaged his home for £5,000 to fund a live demonstration. The risk paid off. Ulva Shield outperformed every competitor, surviving fire tests while others burned to ash. It even earned a rare A1 fire safety rating. Suddenly, Chris was in demand. Oil companies placed orders, and his small business exploded in success. Practically overnight, Christopher Foster went from selling pizza box insulation to becoming a self-made millionaire. And with success came the spending. That same year, after a casual shopping trip, Jill came across a house in a local magazine that caught her eye. It wasn't just any home, it was Osbaston House, an elegant 16-acre estate in the peaceful village of Massacre, Shropshire. Complete with a private lake, horse paddocks, and lush greenery, it looked like something out of a storybook. Now, despite the staggering asking price of around £1.5 million, the mansion was far from perfect. It still required significant renovations and updates, but Jill Foster was completely smitten. The grand 16-acre estate offered privacy, elegance, and space for the luxurious lifestyle she and Chris were building. The moment Jill laid eyes on the property in the Shropshire Life magazine, she was enchanted. By the next morning, Chris didn't hesitate. He made an offer. The Fosters sold their current home, packed up their lives, and relocated to what would become their ultimate dream estate. As soon as they moved in, Chris began spending lavishly. He poured an additional £50,000 into landscaping and installing a brand new swimming pool to match the grandeur of their new home. But the spending didn't stop there. Chris indulged in an extravagant lifestyle that many could only imagine. He bought 2 sleek Porsches, one for himself and one for Jill, a stylish James Bond-like Aston Martin, multiple Range Rovers, a tractor for the estate, and various other high-end vehicles that lined their driveway like trophies. Their daughter, Kirsty, was sent to an elite private boarding school where she was given every possible advantage. Chris also bought her several horses to support her love for riding. Kirsty adored animals and spent her weekends riding and entering competitions. Friends described her as gentle, soft-spoken, and kind, a contrast to the luxury that surrounded her. Alongside her horses, the family also owned 4 dogs and even a collection of doves, adding to the estate's almost fairy tale appearance. To elevate their lifestyle even further, the Fosters hired a full-time housekeeper and a personal assistant. Inside the mansion, every room glistened with opulence, decorated with over £200,000 worth of antique furnishings, hand-picked to match the couple's expensive taste. Chris's obsession with wealth and image extended beyond furniture and cars, however. His most costly passion was shooting. He owned an impressive collection of high-end firearms, some valued between £12,000 and £12,500, nearly $20,000 at the time. He regularly hosted weekend-long clay pigeon shooting parties on the estate, some of which racked up bills of up to £8,000. But Chris's behavior wasn't just excessive, it was often unsettling. He had a habit of leaving his loaded guns around the house carelessly. When the family's doves left droppings on his vehicles, he would simply shoot them on sight, much to Jill's horror. In one particularly disturbing moment, Kirsty's black Labrador chased after a flock of sheep and couldn't be controlled. Chris took the dog for a walk down a country lane and shot it in the head. Though Chris appeared to be a thriving entrepreneur, those close to him noticed he lacked long-term vision. He was described as impulsive, obsessed with instant gratification, and quick to cut ties with anyone who disappointed or challenged him. He wasn't driven by purpose, he was driven by appearances. Social status meant everything to Chris. Over time, both he and Jill began climbing into higher and higher social circles. Chris became fixated on leaving his Wolverhampton roots behind, as though his past no longer fit into the glossy life he had curated. Jill, too, embraced their new life with ease. She spent her days going on shopping sprees, booking nail and hair appointments, and indulging in beauty treatments like Botox and manicures. The couple, along with their daughter and close friends, often went on luxurious holidays, staying in 5-star hotels, dining at the most expensive restaurants, and spending up to £20,000 per trip. These were not rare occasions. They were the norm. Chris never hesitated to throw money at pleasure. But behind the glamour, a darker truth was festering. Unbeknownst to most of those around him, Chris was in deep financial trouble. His outwardly perfect life was being funded by unsustainable borrowing, secret deals, and silent desperation. Back in 2003, Chris had signed an exclusive contract with a company called DRC, giving them sole rights to manufacture and sell the oil rig sealant he had invented, Ulva Shield. At first, this deal looked like a smart move. By 2004, his net worth had soared to over £10 million, but everything unraveled quickly. In 2005, just 1 year later, Chris found himself drowning in debt over £2.8 million. Rather than scale back or cut his losses, he did the opposite. Addicted to his lifestyle, he tried to dig his way out by making riskier financial moves. Despite his exclusive agreement with DRC, he secretly signed a second deal with another company for the sale of his product. When DRC found out, they sued him for breach of contract. The court ruled against him, stripping him of his patent. DRC then turned Ulva Shield into a global success without him. Chris, now facing financial ruin, watched as his company went into liquidation in 2007. £3 million worth of his assets were frozen. His salary stopped. His financial empire had collapsed. But instead of changing course, Chris continued spending like nothing had happened. At the same time, he found himself in a bitter dispute with his accountant, who reported him to the Inland Revenue for tax evasion. Chris had failed to pay VAT, national insurance, and a slew of other taxes. In a last-ditch effort to stay afloat, he borrowed heavily from banks, remortgaged the Osbaston mansion not once but 3 times, and overdrew more than 20 separate bank accounts. Still, he kept the mask on. Even as the walls closed in, Chris continued to host shooting events, drive his luxury cars, and maintain appearances. Those who knew Jill were unsure if she truly understood how dire their situation was. Perhaps Chris had shielded her from the worst of it, or maybe she just didn't want to believe it. Either way, she never seemed to cut back on spending, and she never confided in friends about any financial worries. On the outside, the Fosters looked just as polished and powerful as ever, and as the walls of his carefully built world began to close in, Christopher Foster found himself caught in a storm of financial ruin, personal despair, and unbearable pressure. The once self-made millionaire, who had built a life of luxury from nothing but ambition and risk, was now staring down a future where all of it could be stripped away. The illusion of control that he had fought so hard to maintain was slipping, and Chris knew it. Additionally, conversations with close friends revealed glimpses of the turmoil brewing inside him. When the subject of property came up, Chris made a chilling, offhand remark. He said he would never give up Osbaston House unless it was in a body bag. While others might have dismissed it as a dramatic joke, the tone in his voice was far too serious to ignore. He also told those close to him that he couldn't bear the thought of watching his family suffer, to see Jill and Kirsty stripped of the comfort, status, and lifestyle they had grown so used to. He made it clear, if it came down to losing them or losing everything else, he would rather not be around to witness it at all. In his own twisted way, he believed that taking control of the ending would be better than watching the downfall unfold piece by piece. Behind the scenes, Chris had started seeking professional help. The stress had become too much to hide. On multiple occasions, he visited his doctor and admitted that he was struggling with depression. He even confided that he was having self-harm thoughts, dark, heavy emotions that refused to be shaken off. He was prescribed antidepressants, but tragically, his pleas weren't taken as seriously as they should have been. His downward spiral continued unchecked, wrapped in silence, pride, and shame. Then came the moment that would push him over the edge. In the week leading up to the August bank holiday of 2008, a letter arrived. Quiet, official, and devastating. It was from Birmingham and Five Counties Finance, the financial company that had been managing the legal seizure of assets due to Chris's mountain of unpaid debts. The letter had been posted right on the front gate of the Osbaston estate in plain view. It stated that representatives would be returning the following Tuesday to reclaim the house and everything in it. This news hit like a death sentence. The housekeeper recalled showing Chris the letter. He looked at it confused, as if trying to process what it meant, but said nothing. His silence was telling. This wasn't just a financial setback, it was confirmation that the fantasy was finally collapsing, and it was no longer something he could outrun or cover up. The life he had crafted down to the last antique vase and polished sports car was going to be taken away, publicly. For a man like Christopher Foster, who had spent his entire adult life obsessed with image, status, and material success, the idea of losing everything and having others see him lose it was unbearable. His reputation, his pride, and the illusion of power he projected were all tied to this life. Without it, who was he? More importantly, what would happen to his wife and daughter? On the morning of August 21st, 2008, a close friend reached out to Christopher Foster via text. Sensing that something might be off, they asked the kind of casual question friends often ask without expecting a heavy answer. "How are you doing?" Chris replied with just 6 words, but those 6 words said everything. "Not good. Things are coming to a head for me soon." It was cryptic, dark, and carried a quiet sense of finality. But the friend had no idea what was truly brewing beneath the surface. They didn't know that Chris was standing at the edge of a terrifying decision, and that this would be the last time they'd hear even a hint of what was coming. Just 4 days later, on August 25th, the Foster family received an invitation to a seemingly harmless event, a barbecue and clay pigeon shooting gathering hosted by friends. Nothing unusual, nothing out of the ordinary. Chris, his 49-year-old wife Jill, and their 15-year-old daughter Kirsty accepted the invitation and attended as if everything in their lives was perfectly fine. The 3 of them showed up smiling, laughing, and enjoying themselves, with no visible signs of worry. Chris, in particular, appeared calm and cheerful, his usual charming self. No one suspected a thing. Witnesses later said he was his usual Chris, chatting, joking, and sipping drinks like nothing was wrong. There's even a photo from that event, captured just hours before the horror, that shows the family posing together, radiating warmth and joy. But while the image painted a scene of togetherness and peace, behind Chris's smile was something far darker, something deeply broken. The truth was, he had already made a decision. He just hadn't told anyone. In the days leading up to that fateful evening, Chris had been quietly preparing. He had spent hours online reading self-harm websites, scouring them for methods and information. He had revisited old photo albums, poring over family memories, holidays, birthdays, laughter frozen in time. Those photos weren't just nostalgia, they were his private farewell, a final glance at the life he had built and the people he believed he had failed. In his mind, he wasn't just protecting them, he was preparing to erase them from a future he no longer believed they could survive. After a few hours at the barbecue, Chris turned to Jill and said he was ready to leave. He had had enough of the party. Jill initially wanted to stay a little longer, but eventually agreed. At exactly 8:44 in the evening, the family returned home, captured clearly on their own CCTV cameras. That moment, frozen in grainy footage, marked the last time the Foster family would ever be seen together. Later that night, Jill went up to bed around 11:30. Chris, composed and eerily calm, went to check on Kirsty, who was still awake, texting a friend. At midnight, he disconnected the internet, forcing Kirsty to end her conversation and go to sleep. The house, grand and quiet, fell into darkness, but Chris stayed awake. The plan was already in motion. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Chris picked up one of his firearms, a silenced gun, and walked quietly into the bedroom where his wife was sleeping peacefully. Without hesitation or remorse, he shot her once in the back of the head. She never stirred. She never had a chance to wake up. From there, he moved to his daughter's bedroom. Kirsty was already asleep. Her fate was just as swift and silent. 1 shot to the head. 2 lives gone in seconds. But it didn't end there. With chilling precision, Chris took one of his shotguns and went outside. His next victims were the family's dogs, 4 beloved companions who had lived alongside the family on the estate. One by one, he approached the kennels and shot each dog in the head. Then he walked to the barn, where the horses, Kirsty's prized, cherished animals, were kept. Horses she rode, trained, and loved. He shot them too, every single one. Afterward, he set the barn ablaze with the animals still inside. Surveillance footage would later show him moving through the darkness like a man possessed. Robotic, mechanical, empty. There was no hesitation, no visible emotion, just silence and fire. Knowing that the fire department would respond quickly, Chris had one more act of sabotage. He got into a large horse trailer, drove it to the front entrance of the estate, and parked it directly in the path of emergency access. To ensure no one could move it, he pulled out his gun and shot the tires, deliberately flattening them. He wanted to slow them down. He wanted to make sure the fire had enough time to do what he needed it to do: destroy everything. In the final stage of his deadly plan, Christopher Foster became disturbingly methodical. Armed with his knowledge of fire behavior and destruction, he took calculated steps to ensure total annihilation. He strategically connected hose pipes to his domestic oil tank and began pumping approximately 200 liters of fuel into the cellar of the Osbaston house. This was no impulsive act. It was a firebomb in the making. Chris knew exactly what he was doing, and more chillingly, why. His mindset was clear. If he could no longer keep his wealth and lifestyle, then no one else should have it either. Not the creditors, not the banks, not even the memories. After soaking the cellar and parts of the house with oil, he extended the destruction to the very symbols of his wealth, his luxury cars and prized possessions, dousing them in flammable liquid. Then he struck the match. Within moments, flames roared through the estate like a monster unleashed. The fire tore through walls, devoured ceilings, and spread with terrifying speed. Still armed with a rifle, Chris returned to the bedroom where Jill's lifeless body lay, and in a final, eerie act of twisted devotion, he lay beside her. As the fire closed in, Chris wrapped his arms around his deceased wife. Some believe he may have intended to burn alive as a form of punishment, or maybe as a final gesture of ownership. One last display of control. Christopher's estranged brother, Andrew Foster, later speculated that Chris had no intention of surviving, and he was right. Autopsy results showed that Chris died from smoke inhalation. There were no gunshot wounds, no evidence of struggle, just Chris, Jill, and the Inferno that consumed everything they once were. At exactly 4:11 in the morning, the family's home security system stopped recording. That was when a neighbor, awakened by the eerie glow in the sky and the crackling roar of fire, called emergency services. Firefighters responded quickly, but their path was blocked. The same horse trailer Chris had used to obstruct the entrance now stood in their way, with its tires shot out. By the time they forced their way through, it was too late. The fire had already taken over, raging too fiercely to be contained. As firefighters battled the blaze, horrified neighbors stood by helplessly. Many feared the worst, whispering about the Fosters who were nowhere to be found. The next day, newspapers and news stations issued desperate appeals for the family's whereabouts. Some speculated they had been abducted. Others held out hope that they had escaped and were hiding. At that point, the bodies hadn't been recovered. The truth had not yet surfaced. For 3 full days, emergency crews worked to control the fire and allow investigators to safely enter the ruins. When they finally did, what they found would haunt them. Jill and Christopher's remains were discovered intertwined on what was left of the bed, buried under the rubble that had collapsed into the living room. But Kirsty's body was missing. There was still a flicker of hope that she had survived. That hope was crushed a few days later when fragments of Kirsty's remains were found amid the charred wreckage. Investigators worked with delicate brushes, treating the debris like an archaeological site, gathering every piece they could. Among those remains, a portion of Kirsty's skull revealed the painful truth. She had been shot in the head, just like her mother. The entire family had been killed before the fire even began. With the bodies identified, suspicion turned squarely toward Christopher. The recovery of security footage confirmed it. Chris had carried out each murder, each shot, each calculated step of the massacre. He left behind no last note, no apology, no explanation. But the evidence was undeniable. Investigators also opened a financial investigation, and the truth about Chris's life began to unravel fast. Despite his image as a wealthy businessman, Chris had been hiding an avalanche of debt. By the time of the murders, his liabilities had ballooned to over £4 million. Creditors were closing in, prepared to seize everything: the house, the vehicles, even the smallest assets. But Chris had already taken care of that. He left nothing for them to claim, only ashes. As more details emerged, theories flooded in. Some believed that Chris had snapped from the shame of financial failure, that he couldn't bear the public downfall. Others saw it as a monstrous act of control, by a man who would rather obliterate everything than admit defeat. His mother, Enid, was heartbroken. She refused to believe her son could be capable of such cruelty. In her eyes, he did it out of love, to protect his family from the humiliation of losing everything. But Andrew, his brother, saw things differently. The two had not spoken for 16 years. There were times Andrew had considered visiting, if only for the sake of their mother, but fear always stopped him. Their childhood had been filled with tension and trauma. Andrew alleged that Chris was a bully, a control freak, and had even assaulted him during their youth. In 1999, Andrew had written Chris a letter trying to reconcile. Chris's reply was chilling. He demanded a written apology, telling Andrew that he needed to beg and scrape on bended knee to be allowed back into his and Jill's life. The history between the brothers painted a stark portrait of a man consumed by pride, control, and vengeance. 4 months after the tragedy, on December 19, 2008, a joint funeral was held for 15-year-old Kirsty and 49-year-old Jill at their local village church. It was quiet, intimate, and attended only by close friends and family. As per Jill's family's wishes, both were laid to rest together in the same burial plot. Christopher Foster was buried separately in another location, alone and far from the wife and daughter he claimed to love. In the years following the Osbaston house tragedy, the ruins of the estate remained untouched. Charred furniture, melted debris, and even small remnants of the Fosters' life, like Kirsty's first aid manual for her horses and a handwritten meal plan, still lay scattered across the ground like ghosts of what once was. The 16-acre estate was finally cleared in 2011. In 2012, it was put up for sale but failed to find a buyer. It wasn't until 2014 that Kevin Gorski stepped in and purchased the land for a cut price of £400,000. With hopes of giving the property a new beginning and helping the community heal from the horror that once stood there, Gorski invested £1 million into building his dream home. But instead of renewal, he found ruin. Now, Gorski claims the house he built is a death trap. He says the structure is so unstable that heavy 60-kilogram stone slabs and massive cornerstones could collapse at any moment, likening the danger to a giant Jenga tower on the verge of toppling. 2 stones have already fallen, and Gorski fears someone could be killed if emergency repairs aren't made soon. Worse, he says he's already electrocuted himself while living in the house and now faces a staggering £350,000 repair bill. He's taken legal action against the builder, who he claims refuses to accept responsibility, blaming everything from the warm sun to the architects and inspectors. Gorski, who used compensation money from a near-fatal motorbike crash in 2008 to fund the build, says he's out of funds and out of options. "It's like this place has a past that doesn't want to let me escape from," he said. "What was meant to be a symbol of healing now feels like a haunting reminder of a tragedy that refuses to stay buried." Now, I want to hear your thoughts on this case. Do you believe Christopher Foster acted out of love, so desperate to shield his family from a life of poverty that he saw no other way out? Or was he simply a narcissist so obsessed with control and appearances that he couldn't bear the thought of losing everything, even if it meant taking the people he claimed to love down with him? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you've made it this far, be sure to check out this next video. I think you'll enjoy it. Thank you once again for watching.